Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online. Hi, if you're watching online. So whether you're in Bristol or you're far away, you can join in the conversation. So my name is Martin O'Leary. I am the studio community lead here. I'm a white man in my 40s with long hair and a beard, wearing a t-shirt which we've just had an argument about the colour of. I say it's dark blue. Every Friday, we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend time in our space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Especially big welcome to anyone who's new to the studio. Can anyone who's new to the studio put your hand up? I'm sure there are some online. So if you are watching online and are new to the studio, this bit is for you. What is the Pervasive Media Studio? We're a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology, everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. And we're a partnership between Watershed, where we are right now, UWE Bristol and the University of Bristol, and we're funded by Arts Council England. And what we do is we offer studio space, including desks, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, all for free to our residents as part of a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. And most of all, we're a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and make some time for collaboration. So a few notes before we begin. Please do feel free to move around. The kitchen's back there. You can make a cup of tea or coffee, grab some water. We have a quiet space just next to here, to my left, to your right. So if anyone who needs to take a break at any point, you can pop in through there. It's well soundproof. There's bean bags on the sofa. We are not expecting a fire drill. If you hear a fire alarm, probably real. The fire exits are at the other side of the studio, at the other end of the studio. Again, my left, your right, at either end. But in any event, if there is a fire, the studio team will direct you. And there are accessible toilets, including baby change, over there in the corridor next to the kitchen. There will be a Q&A at the end of this talk. So those of you who are watching online, you can pop your questions into the YouTube chat. Lauton will be your voice in the room today. If you're in the building, then stick your hand up and we'll send around a microphone so the folks who are at home can hear you. You can get news on all of our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, or at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. All right, so before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to hand over quickly to Amy Rose, the curator of our new immersive gallery space, Watershed, to talk a little bit about the new collection that's opening there this weekend.
Thanks, Liam.
Thank you.
Sorry for taking a little bit of your time.
I love it, no. The more the merrier.
Fast.
Take your time.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that we're opening a new collection in Watershed this evening. It opens to the public from tomorrow, but we're having a little small party. You're welcome if you'd like to stay. It's from 6 till 8:30 this evening, like around the bar. And you can come and get a sneak preview of the exhibition, as well as a couple of the artists who are really wonderful are here, and they're going to speak about their work. So those two artists are, one of them is Sanne de, I'm going to say her name wrong, Wild. She's from Belgium, and she has a beautiful piece called The Island of the Colorblind. And the other artist is called Chris Samuel, and he is from Leicester. And that's him, yeah, little shout out. The work as a whole in the collection is part of Sing the Body Electric, which is an exhibition in 2 parts. The second part is still exploring the body and embodied experience. But this collection is more about perception and what we see and what we don't see in the world around us in a kind of embodied way. So maybe that's about what kind of body you have that means that you encounter the world in a particular way. Or maybe it's about which bodies get seen and unseen. So please come along, try the work, tell us what you think. And I hand over to Liam to talk about his amazing work.
I was going to intro Liam first, but it's all right. Our speaker for today is Liam. Liam Taylor-West. Liam is a composer and audiovisual artist who works primarily with live musicians and new technology, as well as a studio resident. Today he's here to talk to us about how the lineup of the orchestra has changed over the years, as well as how it hasn't. and about the work of two Bristol-based organisations, Paraorchestra and the National Open Youth Orchestra, to reimagine orchestras as more inclusive ensembles that enable the participation of musicians with disabilities. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Liam.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Yeah, as Martin said, I'm a composer and artist. When people ask me what I do, I'm also a resident here at the Pervasive Media Studio, so you might have seen me around. When people ask me what I do, I tend to say I work with orchestras as a way of bundling a lot of things into one and hopefully moving the conversation on. But given that we're now going to talk about it, we should probably unpack the sort of jobs I do and what they are. So composing is the top one. That's fairly self-explanatory, you know, writing a new piece from scratch, which you then hand over to an orchestra to play. Arranging, orchestrating, that sits along the line of creative to non-creative. It's slightly less fully creative as composing. You're given a piece of music that already exists, and you're sort of just working out another way to present it for a different lineup of players. I think of it a bit like being handed a sort of a picture, like a line drawing, and just changing the colours, so that, you know, the frame remains the same, but everything else can be totally changed. Below that, copyist work. I do a lot of this. This is working with composers or orchestras. Generally, you're not changing the piece, but you're perhaps, if it's a new piece that's come from a composer, you're cleaning it up, checking for errors, proofreading, and then getting the materials ready for the orchestra to play. Sometimes if it's coming from the orchestra, there's a piece that they have found, but looks hideous. It's handwritten and, you know, hundreds of years old, so it's just modernizing things. And then finally, librarian. Every orchestra will have a librarian. It's the person that, when they have a program, they say, okay, we want to play this music, and the librarian finds where you would get the sheet music, works out who you need to get rights from or pay, tell the fixer if they need to book any other musicians, and then get the music out to the players. So those are the kind of 4 tasks I tend to do. So as we go through this talk, those are the sort of roles I've been playing in these organisations. But for this talk, I want to focus on these 2 organisations. Both are Bristol-based, the National Open Youth Orchestra and Paraorchestra. One is a youth group and one is a professional adult group. Both are ensembles formed of disabled and non-disabled musicians. And I think it's best if I take the text from their websites to describe them. National Open Youth Orchestra describes itself, from now on I'll say no-yo, it's just quicker. It's a pioneering, inclusive orchestra where brilliant 11 to 25-year-old disabled and non-disabled musicians rehearse and perform together. It promotes inclusion by performing exciting music, written and arranged for a diverse group of musicians and instruments. I'm going to pause, there's quite a lot of chat. Paraorchestra say we are a fearless collective of disabled and non-disabled musicians, a platform that pushes the boundaries of music making to create art with passion and purpose. For those of you based in Bristol, you might well have seen some concerts of either group. Paraorchestra have done a couple of pretty large-scale projects in the Bristol Beacon, including opening it. So why do they need to mention that they're groups formed of disabled and non-disabled musicians? I mean, it turns out that orchestras, both youth orchestras and adult pro orchestras, generally have very, very few disabled musicians within them. And both Paraorchestra and No-Yo have sort of explored why that's the case, and we're going to look at a bit of that today. They boil it down to 2 key things. One is the instruments. What instruments do you need to make up an orchestra? And the other one is the repertoire. What music do orchestras play? And these things kind of go hand in hand. It's a bit of a chicken and egg. You know, was the repertoire written for the instruments of the orchestra, or did you book the musicians to play the repertoire? And as you go back hundreds of years, these things get quite intertwined. So we're going to do that. We're going to do a brief history of the orchestra. I found this picture on Google as the sort of funniest old orchestra image I could find, really. Very kind of 2-dimensional, almost sort of Wes Anderson, black and white image of an orchestra in their concert dress. So in order to do this, I think it's worth looking at the development of a style of music or a genre or a type of piece called the symphony, which Wikipedia describes as an extended musical composition in Western classical music, most often for orchestra. It's because of this that the word symphony is often associated with orchestras. London Symphony Orchestra, City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. The Symphony Orchestra, they've kind of become intertwined. It's worth looking at this style of music just because it really puts the focus on the music, on the orchestra, sorry, rather than other styles. I've put a few examples here. Masses and requiems, orchestras are also used in these pieces, but they're religious settings, and the focus is perhaps on God. Operas, perhaps the focus is on the narrative or the singing. Concertos, focus might be on the soloist. So back in the day, the symphony was where composers would really focus in on the orchestra and push the boundaries of that organism, if you could call it that. And given that we're doing a brief introduction, I'm going to avoid any nuance and just go straight with the sort of early textbook version, which is the development of the symphony comes through the development. You look at the first Viennese school, which tends to be a description of these three composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. They're useful to look at partially because they're still famous nowadays, but also because they were famous in their lifetimes, which meant they were able to, there was a large influence that they held over other people around them. So given that we're looking at symphonies, if you look at Haydn's first symphony, which was the earliest of the group, and then Beethoven's last symphony, the Ninth Symphony, it's a span of 65 years, which might feel like a long time. But when you think that it's been 200 years since Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and most change to the orchestra has happened in this period, it suddenly feels like quite a movable time. So let's look at them. So the first page of Haydn's first symphony looks like this. So the orchestra is oboes, horns, and strings. And the strings are violins, violas, cellos, and basses. Cellos and basses are on the same line. You don't see it here, but the bass line would also have had a harpsichord player improvising a sort of harmony. But, it all sits basically on 6 lines on the page. Beethoven, that's the front page of his Ninth Symphony. So immediately you see it's exploded in terms of size. So you've got flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, you've got horns, you've got trumpets, you've got trombones, although they're not on the first page, timpani and percussion, and then you've got the strings. And this is kind of the layout of the standard orchestra today. It hasn't really changed very much since then. I'd say that the tuba and the harp are the kind of key additions that have found a home there. But generally, if you're playing in your local youth orchestra or most orchestras, that's the standard lineup. Anything else tends to get added into the extras category. And then also, not only has the piece expanded vertically with more instruments, but they've also expanded massively in terms of duration. So Haydn's first symphony is 13 minutes long, whereas Beethoven's is over an hour. So, that period of time really was a bit of an explosion. So the question is, why stop there? And this is where it's hard to discuss it without talking about nuance and more interesting kind of digging into it. But the role of the composer changed a lot, and society changed a lot in that time. Haydn was a court composer for most of his life for someone called Prince Anton, who was the head of the Esterhazy family, who were a very, very wealthy family. And he lived with them, and his job was to compose music for their court musicians, and that was most of his life. He was you could say, a sort of glorified servant, really. And it was only till later when he retirement's the wrong word, but the prince died, and when the son took over, he was less interested in music, so Haydn was free to kind of travel the world a bit with a bit of a pension. And in his case, luckily, the sheet music had been passed around, he'd been published, and he was pretty famous around Europe, and he went to London, and he kind of had a sort of retirement victory lap, really. By the time you reach Beethoven, society's changed quite a bit. There's been a kind of emerged middle class, and this sort of music is not just being played in the very wealthy houses of people like the Esterhazy family, but you get the public concert that we know today, sort of thing. So people with some money can pay and go and see a concert. And with that comes discussion and music press and opinions. And given that Beethoven had such a huge influence, that piece is massive, he was very famous, he becomes the sort of figure of the genius, and you should respect what's on the page, and that really has an impact for the next 200 years. While we're talking about accessibility in music, it's worth pointing out that Beethoven was completely deaf by the time he wrote his last symphony. So that's just an interesting side note. And just as a kind of example of this, if you want a frustrating read, you could look at the life of Adolphe Sax, who was a Belgian inventor and maker of musical instruments, who moved to Paris to try and sort of promote and sell and make popular his invention, the saxophone, and faced incredible resistance from instrument makers in Paris and everyone. And it's a really frustrating story of kind of legal battles and bankruptcy, and every time you think he's got the upper hand, something happens. Like the French military bands were known to not be very good around Europe, and so they held a competition of how could they improve, and a band was put together with saxophones in, and it was noticeably much better. And the king or emperor, I forget exactly what, said, okay, French military bands will have saxophones in, which was a major, promotion for Adolphe Sax. And then there was a revolution, and that king was gone, and then he was bankrupt, and he had to flee. It's a really brutal time, and for him, and probably many others. But still, the saxophone is not a standard instrument in the orchestra. And it wasn't until several years after Adolphe Sax's death that it became hugely popular in jazz and becomes the instrument that we know and love today. On the right is the bass clarinet. That's the one sort of silver lining for Adolphe Sax. He invented a better version of the bass clarinet, which found its ways into orchestras. So there we go. Okay, back to present day, back to No-Yo and Paraorchestra. How have they tackled these two topics that I talked about? If instruments and repertoire are a bit of a problem with making orchestras accessible, how do you handle that? And generally, I think you could summarize their approaches as both of them have no specifically required instruments in their membership, and they welcome the addition of new instruments and new technologies. And alongside that, any pre-existing music that they play is adapted as standard to fit their lineup, and they commission and perform lots of new music, which is great. It's also how I first was introduced to working with these groups, with No-Yo, which at the time was called SWOYO, which was the Southwest Open Youth Orchestra, and has since expanded across the country. So this is the end of a piece, the first piece I wrote for them called The Umbrella in 2017. I'll just play a little snippet at the end so you can see what's going on, and then we'll dive into some of the players you can see. So one of the instruments you saw, the screen was a little bit dark, but I think it was there, was the Linstrument, which is an instrument that lies flat on the table with coloured lights on on a grid of squares across it, which the player plays by pressing down. And once you've pressed the note, you can move your hand in several directions to affect the note. It's good for players that can't use pedals like a piano requires. I think it's tuned like a guitar. So if you go up the instrument away from yourself, it's tuned in fifths and then semitones along for the technical musicians here. The instrument was designed by Roger Lynn, and so for a more positive musical instrument maker story, I just want to briefly mention him. He invented the Lynn LM1, which was a drum machine that was used a lot in the 80s in lots of pop records, Prince, Michael Jackson. A lot of 80s pop music, you'll be hearing the Lynn LM1 drum machine. And then also the Akai MPC, which is an instrument that was massively influential in the world of hip-hop and electronic music. So Jay Dilla used the Akai MPC. DJ Shadow produced his first album entirely on an Akai MPC. So there's a more positive story of success for musical instrument makers. But his instrument features a lot in the accessible ensemble world nowadays. The other instrument you would have seen was the clarion, which might explain why this slideshow has got coloured squares all over it. But the clarion is a screen-based instrument. There are coloured shapes on the screen, and the way you play it is you move the cursor using however you would use a cursor if you, as someone who uses a screen, and you move into the note, you move into the shape, sorry, and that plays a note. The different colours represent different pitches, and within the note there are different expression ranges. The speed at which you enter, changes the velocity of the note. The way you leave the note changes its decay. There's a lot of technical stuff going on behind a very immediately accessible front page, which is these shapes. It was developed by Open Up Music, which is the organisation that run Noyo. And the point of it being is that if you can use a screen or a device that has a screen, you can play the clarion. In the video you saw Bradley, who's on the left in this image, he's facing away. Bradley has very good control of his eyes, so he played the clarion by literally looking at the shapes and the screen at the point at which he wanted to play. He uses an eye gaze device to follow his eye movements. And then George on the right, you can't really see in the image, he's got a dot in the middle of his glasses. George has very good head movements, and so as he moved, an infrared camera could pick up this reflective dot in the center of his glasses. I'll play another clip which shows a moment which features the clarion more prominently, and a solo of Bradley's. Go with Bradley's eye gaze, and it's very, very hard to control slow and steady movement with your eyes. Eyes tend to dart to new locations, so the amount of expression that he achieves there is really amazing. The downside of having to use your eyes to play an instrument is that you can't therefore look somewhere else. And there's a later point in the piece, you can see using your periphery what a conductor's doing perhaps, but there's a piece a bit later in the piece where Bradley and Ellen on the horn have to kind of sync up. So you'll see that she stands up and they, line up to kind of synchronize. I'll play that moment, which is quick now. Like this. So if you're using your eyes to play something, like I said, you can't also be looking somewhere else. So a player like Bradley, isn't able to also check on sheet music. So it's worth discussing sheet music here very briefly, just because I think sheet music is fantastic, and in the case of those early composers, that was how their music was disseminated, and they gained popularity around the world. And you wouldn't want to think of it as a barrier to being an ensemble, and no orchestra would say it's a requirement to be in an orchestra, but practically, schedules of orchestra now means that there's very rarely much rehearsal time, and orchestras that play concerts often will have a day, perhaps two, before the concert to rehearse. And if you're in the scoring world, film scoring orchestras generally just turn up on the day, music's in front of them, excellent sight readers, they just play it, record it, and it's all done. So, you know, that becomes a barrier if you don't read music or aren't able to read sheet music. So both ensembles, Know-Yo and Paraorchestra, sort of treat sheet music as a bit different. It's one of several options of learning the music for the concert. So as long as you're given enough time, if you read music, then great, you can use the sheet music. But if not, we provide a lot of audio tracks. You can export sheet music in a way that it can be read by Braille readers. Several different methods of learning the music. And as long as the music is learned by the time of the concert, that works fine. And in several of Paraorchestra's concerts, they've actually memorized the music across the whole ensemble, has memorized it. If anyone saw the Virtuous Circle, which was a photo of Paraorchestra a few slides back, most of that was memorized by the orchestra. So, you know, the sheet music becomes a process used earlier on. And in terms of the clarion, here's a picture of how we've sort of started adapting sheet music to suit the clarion, where you match the colours of the notes to the pitches on the page. And then in terms of commissioning and building the repertoire, here's a little snippet from that piece, The Umbrella. It's specifically, so the way this piece was worked, I met up with the orchestra every fortnight at their rehearsals and met the players and then wrote the piece specifically for those players. In the years since, Know-Yo have realised that, you know, their lineup completely changes every year, and commissioning these really bespoke pieces for, you can see a violin, two clarions, l'instrument, and it continues down the page that you can't see. You know, it's just as bad as the Beethoven problem. You've got a really fixed piece that isn't actually adaptable. So going forward, this is a piece they've commissioned for their next year's concerts from Ufat Sol Zizo. And this is presented in what's called open score. So you can see it's again only part of the score, but there are two staves which are for high instruments. There's upper middle 1 and upper middle 2, and then it will continue down the page. So it's scored more for kind of styles of instruments or groups of instruments. And that becomes part of their planning for the future. And in terms of looking ahead to the future, what else is happening? I'm part of this composer mentoring program, which Know-Yo are doing with ABRSM. ABRSM is the associated board of the Royal Schools of Music. So they run the grade exams, really. If you're a kid in school, very likely you're doing ABRSM grade exams, grade 1 through to 8. In the picture is Ali, who's a clarion player who's just graduated from Know-Yo, and he's doing a lot of work. Him and I run this composer mentoring program together, where ABRSM bring in a cohort of composers, introduce their different educational platforms like other youth orchestras, jazz orchestras, and the composers write new pieces for their grade books and things like that. So they've been writing new pieces for clarion. Ali is really busy. He's got a trio, he's doing that, and he's also playing in an orchestra. As I mentioned before, there are sort of, not every orchestra has all the instruments, and I mentioned the harp. I think Ali is on the clarion playing a lot of the harp parts, which his orchestra, they don't have a harpist. So that's a really good meeting of requirements being matched. There's also the Clarion Open Music Assessment. So ABRSM have their grade exams, but they also have something called Open Music and Assessment, where if you play an instrument which isn't represented in their books, like the clarion isn't, or say the bagpipes or something like that, they have a scheme of which you can be assessed in your ability, which might sound like not much fun, but I think when you're learning something, it's helpful to know where you stand, and it's good to have role models or just a sense. It's not for everyone, but a sense of how you're progressing whilst learning that instrument. And then finally, the other thing is something coming up called Play with Paraorchestra, which is where Paraorchestra have put out a call and have recruited, I think, 6 teenage young musicians with disabilities to play alongside pro players in a 2-day workshop. And this is a way of sort of, from there, sort of bridging that gap between Yo and Paraorchestra and kind of forming a bit of a career progression through it. And thank you. That's the end. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yes.
I was just wondering, that was a sick talk, by the way. Cool.
Thank you.
I was wondering what the next steps are in the next, 5 years we're looking at ahead.
Yeah, I think both organisations, I'll speak on behalf of the organisations, but I'm not actually, I'm not fully employed by either. I work with both. But my understanding is that, yeah, they're both sort of trying to merge the gap in both directions. So Yo would sort of pick up the younger cohort of players. I should say Yo is for the kind of really highly skilled young players. Open Up Music, which is the organisation that developed the clarion, also runs something called Open Orchestras, which takes clarion and runs music projects in special schools. So they've got a kind of wider reach. I don't know the statistic, but I think genuinely 100 or so young players in the country are playing the clarion. So there is a sort of early stage. Yo represents the kind of, good standard youth players who will join Yo. And then there's that kind of bridging the gap of sort of allowing people like Ali to become working professional musicians who might play in Paraorchestra, they might play in other groups. So it's just about setting some sort of precedent for these things to exist, which haven't really, other than real rarities beforehand, I'd say. I think that answered the question. Cool. Yeah, Joe.
Hi, yeah,
Hello.
thanks. I also really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
So I was really struck by your history that you gave and by these kind of 3 people and the kind of narrowness of the origin of this form. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any kind of compositional constraints that might also, for you as a composer, that might also be affecting the kind of accessibility of the form and how you approach those?
Yeah, totally. That is something that we've talked about quite a lot when I've been writing music or working with other composers with these organisations. Yeah, it's interesting. The kind of form of music, I showed those examples of how a symphony moved from 13 minutes to over an hour. Ali played in the project with Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra. Ali was the clarion player that I mentioned towards the end. And he was going to play clarion they were playing a symphony by a composer called Borodin, which is a long, almost an hour piece. And we were kind of adapting some of the parts, violin parts or something, to be performed on the clarion. The problem was, you can see on the screen that there are these coloured shapes. I mean, it wasn't a problem, it happened, but it just, when you play the violin, you've got all the potential notes you could play right there. Whereas with the clarion, the layout of the shapes and the empty space is really important. You need the empty space in order to have silence, otherwise it's just always notes. So Ali did it, but it was rifling through, I think, 30 or so different patterns, which, maybe isn't a problem, but it's not hugely suited to him as a player. And so when me or other people have written music for Yo or other groups, the first clip I showed, you might have seen Bradley's part was the same pattern and he just played a bit of it. And then when he went round, he played a bit more and a bit more. And while that's happening, there's other things going on. So it's sort of about trying to maximise your use of materials in a way. It's a really interesting question. I mean, it's something, those early scores, I didn't want to go into this much detail, but the horns said horns in D or horns in F. So these are natural horns that don't have any buttons, which means you can only really play in one key, one musical key, because that's what note comes out when you blow the horn, and you can change following a harmonic series. This is getting technical, but so that was a limitation at that time, and then they invented the valve horn, which can play any note, and so that was a requirement that changed the sort of music that was written. So I think it's something that is really interesting and we've talked about a lot, because you don't want to limit players and composers, but at the same time there are practicalities. That was quite long. I don't know if that's really answered what you said, but it is discussed about.
Yeah, no, I was just interested in, it's nice to hear a bit of the technical detail actually, and interested to hear a bit more about it.
Generally the history of the orchestra has been a kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I think nowadays, even away from the sort of accessible music scene, there's an awareness that you can't always have thousands of people on stage, and not everyone wants that, and people often prefer smaller ensembles that sound better and more intimate when recorded, or that you can get close to, or things like that. So yeah, it's discussed a lot actually, and a lot of repertoire from the 1900s is just too massive and pompous and ridiculous that, you know, very often people look a couple of hundred years earlier for something which is almost more relatable in a way. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Are there any instruments that are out there? You know the theremin where you just move your hand. Is there any instruments that's a little bit more 3D than that?
Yeah, that's a really good, more 3D than the clarion or than the...
I guess more, because I guess the theremin allows you to move and bend, whereas the clarion is really specific about the notes.
Yeah.
You can't bend.
That's right. Actually, funny enough, the first piece I wrote for clarion, I didn't show a clip of it, but I kind of the clarion just takes MIDI data out of the screen and that goes into the computer. And I slightly rewired it so that when you went up and down the shape, you could pitch bend, but it was at the expense of volume control. Do you know what I mean? It only has one, at the moment, it only has one thing that you can shift. So although it was cool and it could do the theremin thing of pitch bending, it was all one volume. And I think on theremin, you probably can go up and down to change volume and get closer to... I mean, the theremin's a really good example of an instrument that is probably also quite accessible. And clarion, we've discussed this, if you have a visual impairment, clarion gives you no tactile feedback on the screen, and it really is not very good for, if you can't see the screen, I think the theremin would be more useful in that setting. But yeah, I mean, I'd love the theremin. I don't know why that doesn't appear more. Maybe it's expensive or something.
Maybe, because I've got in my kind of unicorn head gloves that you can move and bend and make, so that you can actually move your hands to make the notes a bit like you were using a cello or something like that.
Yeah, it's a project that Paraorchestra did that I was involved in, and actually Martin came along to with Lowy, I think, it was called Tech and Play, and they got a few of their players from the pool of Paraorchestra players who were fantastic musicians but didn't use technology much, and they brought in lots of technology for them to try, including the clarion, which is why I was there, but also some gloves developed by Tom, I've forgotten his surname, but he's at UWE.
Tom Mitchell.
That's it, exactly. Tom Mitchell was there, and yeah, so exactly what you described. You should have a look. What are they called? The Mimu gloves. Yeah, so exactly. He's developed something which has a lot of sensors in these gloves, which the computer picks up, and you can, exactly as you described, shape the sound and things like that. They're great. Yeah.
And I've got another question.
Yes, yeah.
So would it be possible to take some of those old classics that don't really have relevance now, but adapt them, or is that the kind of thing that would just be so sacrilegious for the music?
It depends who you ask, and I think that I took a long way around it, but I think sacrilegious is sort of the word as to why things remain quite fixed for 200 years. I think for a long time in the 19th and 20th centuries, it would have been quite sacrilegious. I think nowadays, generally not. I think there are orchestras that would not change how they are and change how the music is played. And also they don't need to, because those orchestras that are excellent players and are still in the format that they've been. So why change it? But I think a lot of groups, and I think people are very open nowadays to things being adapted. It's fully in the pipeline of how No-Yo works. And Paraorchestra, the virtuous circle that I mentioned, was a Mozart symphony intertwined with new music by Oliver Vibrans, and they kind of blended the two together, and it was great. You had the old instruments playing the Mozart, but the players were kind of moving around the amphitheatre. and then they would sort of retreat, and the synths and everyone would join and play Ollie's music, and so it was a blending of the two in a really effective way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? I've got one if no one does.
Yeah.
So it seems to me like there's sort of 3 different approaches. You've got things like the clarion, where you're just building a whole new instrument. You've got stuff like the Linstrument, where it's like a modern instrument and an electronic instrument, which is quite configurable. Or you've got like adapting or finding ways for people to play the trombone, say, or the violin, or whatever. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how those fit into your thinking about this.
Yeah, there's, when I said there's been very few examples of professional musicians with disabilities in the past, there are examples, and generally, I mentioned that Beethoven, for the later stage of his life, was completely deaf and was still composing and conducting and performing. You get people like, before I now list people, I'd say the examples tended to be people who have found ways of adapting, themselves to suit standard instruments, quote unquote. So Evelyn Glennie, who's deaf, is a percussionist and performs with bare feet to feel the vibrations. I would say that there are people within the organisations I have mentioned that play new instruments, but then a lot who have found adaptations. Lisa Beck, who might have been at one of those events, they I think of a form of epilepsy that, regardless, they've adapted a recorder. They are a professional recorder player, but found that something about the method of playing was interacting badly, and so they've made what is called a robo-recorder, which is this adapted and tweaked instrument. And that probably exists somewhere in the middle. It's an old instrument that has been brought up to date with technology. Does that sort of answer something?
Yeah, I think sort of what I was getting at was like, for a lot of people, some of the value of listening to an orchestra is the violins and the cellos and the...
Yes.
And then like how much are you drifting from what an orchestra is when it's clarions and so on?
Yeah.
Versus trying to replicate the old form versus inventing something new.
I think that's true. I think I should say I'm not advocating the dismantling of orchestras. I love orchestras and they serve a great purpose. And when I say orchestras, I mean, historical, traditional orchestras. I imagine there's a sort of spectrum between the two. I mean, film soundtracks are a good example where almost always the standard orchestra is boosted with saxophones, guitars, drum kit, whatever instruments the composer has pulled together. So there's probably a world in which I'm imagining the best success story out of this is the kind of modern hybrid orchestra, which has the historical roots, but it's absolutely normal to have synths and all these other sounds as part of it, which could be played on a clarion or a synthesizer or whatever. And I think more importantly that there are pieces that people know and recognise and want to hear that calls on that, because that was sort of the self-perpetuating problem that I mentioned before. If everyone loves Beethoven and for 200 years that's what you want an orchestra to play, that keeps the orchestra in that format. Whereas it'll probably happen already. There are probably already tunes from soundtracks which need synthesizers for extra low sounds or some ridiculous horn or something, which will enter the repertoire at these kind of film music concerts. So I think it might just happen naturally with some, input from others.
Sorry, another question. How much does what you're doing seems like a total luxury if the original orchestras are still unable to get money to play, all the cuts in funding, et cetera, with everything else that's gone on for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. So how does that make your work even harder?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's both National Open Youth Orchestra and Paraorchestra receive a decent amount of Arts Council funding, whereas traditional orchestras, I keep using that word, but you know what I mean, generally have had a decrease in their funding. I'm not quite sure how they level out. I still imagine certainly organisations like the Opera House, Royal Opera House, although it's received a massive cut, still receives millions of pounds. So there's probably a bit of a balancing act happening. But you're right, in terms of how they run their business, it's a bit of a problem. These two organisations have been able to expand in recent years, which is wonderful. Whereas the other concerts are finding it slightly tricky. So I'm aware that things like adapting every piece for every concert perhaps isn't possible for some of these orchestras. I don't know what the answer is to that one. More audiences, more concerts. I don't-
Well, just maybe part of the answer is that we don't understand orchestras to be the preserve of a particular form of music.
Yeah.
And that actually there's loads of arts and culture that would love to have loads of instruments and players come together to perform in a live way. And that it feels like what you're doing is actually making it much more relevant. So that, yeah, I'm challenging the notion of luxury somewhat.
I think I just meant it was, would it be easier for you if we went back like 40 years and all the old-fashioned orchestras were getting all their money? Would it be easier for you to, because you're in the seat of progress. So would it be easier? Is it hard? Does it make it harder for you or easier that that's happened?
What's happened? The change in funding or the?
Yeah. Just
No, I'd say it's harder all round. I think even the orchestras that are not like these two, are wanting to become more inclusive in their own way. And I think the cuts in funding only make that harder. So that's easier to answer, that one. But I think in terms of what you said, Joe, certainly the orchestra as a body of players is a really exciting thing still. And film soundtrack, game soundtrack, these concerts sell out generally. They're really popular. So it's not like the idea of the orchestra is dying. It's sort of just there's a route through that needs to be found. That's a way I can back out of that question.
Any last questions from anyone? In that case, we'll say thank you very much to Liam.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
All right, before you go, please don't forget Sing the Body Electric Collection 2 on show from tomorrow at Watershed. And tonight, if you come along to the bar at 6 o'clock, tickets are on sale at the Watershed box office for the exhibition generally, but you can just rock up tonight if you feel like it. If you want to stick around in Hot Desk today or find out more about what we do, please come find one of the studio team. Studio team, give us a wave. Here we are. And we'll be happy to help. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk with any questions. Thank you all for being here today, and we'll see you all again next time.
Cool.